We've got a
I don't accept that.
theist from Pennsylvania ready to come in. This is going to be Lewis. Says the existence of consciousness points to there being a God. Lewis, are you with us?
Hi, can you hear me well?
Yeah, I can hear you. How you doing?
Good, how are you?
Very good. Thank you for asking. Is the prompt correct? Do you think the existence of our consciousness points to God?
Well, I think it could certainly be seen that way. It's hard to explain how consciousness arises from materialism alone, but it certainly doesn't prove that there's a God. But it could certainly be seen as something that points to it. I think it's a bit ignorant to pretend that there's nothing that could be seen as pointing to God, but I could see how that's getting subjective, but it's also subjective for you to take that and say that it doesn't point to it.
Wait, so what are you trying to show? That consciousness shows that there's something beyond materialism or God?
I'm just saying that consciousness could be seen as something that points to God.
How though?
I mean, whenever you...
Okay, what do you mean by God? What do you mean by God?
Into your show, something beyond materialism, something beyond matter.
So does it have to be conscious?
I also think it's interesting. How before you even heard my argument, you sort of, and really I don't like to argue, I like to have discussions, but before you even heard it, you were kind of making fun of it, which fundamentally shows bias towards it not being true.
When did we make fun of it? We're trying to clarify, we're trying to understand what you're saying. We're asking questions to be able to understand what you're talking about. So before you make your argument, I have to know what we're trying to prove.
I'm not trying to prove anything. I'm just showing the fundamental bias in the things that
we're having a discussion.
And how,
this is not a bias. Okay, Lewis, it seems like you are very sensitive. I feel like you're overly sensitive.
No, sorry.
Because when we yeah, I think you should let your guard down. I think you get really upset really fast. I think it's okay. We're having a discussion. We're just trying to understand what you're saying, right? So we're clarifying. So you don't want to call it a debate. You don't want to act like you're trying to prove anything. Okay, we want to have a discussion about whether consciousness shows that a God exists. Okay, whether it hints at it, even if it doesn't prove it, does maybe points in that direction. Okay, for me to be able to understand if what you're saying has any validity or not. Okay, as we could have a friendly discussion about it, I just first want to be on the same page as you. Because many times when I talk to people about God, we start having a discussion about God, and then I realize that, they were talking about something completely different that I assumed. So I don't want to make a false assumption so that we don't get misdirected. So I just want to understand what you mean by God. So when I ask you what you mean by God, you said something that is not material. Anything, based on your understanding of what God is, anything beyond material, you would categorize it as God, or does it have any other, do you need to specify it more, or is that enough? Anything beyond material?
I think that the issue here is that you're pushing me to come up with a definition for God, but God is inherently something that I can't fully understand. I'm merely saying that consciousness can be seen as something that points to there being God.
So
okay, let's work with that. Okay.
I guess my question is if you can't tell us what the thing is that consciousness is pointing to, how do we know that consciousness is pointing to a thing?
Right.
I'm not saying that we know. I'm saying that it could be seen that way. Really, I'm trying to highlight the fundamental problems in the show here.
Wait, did you come to provide a rational argument, or did you come to complain about the show? Because we're not interested in meta commentary. We want to have a good faith dialogue with you about your belief system.
I'm pointing out
we don't even know what you're talking about, and it seems like you are admitting that you also don't know what you're talking about. So how could we even have a conversation about what consciousness points to if we don't even know what you're talking about? And so you're saying consciousness points to X, and you're like, okay, what is X? And you're like, I don't know.
Okay, I'll clarify.
I have no definition for it. So we can't even begin to have a conversation of what consciousness, if consciousness points to X or not, if you cannot tell us what that X is, and you can't tell us, and you don't seem to know it yourself, how is this even a productive conversation?
I'll give you a more concise statement that you can respond to. The possibility
of God
exists.
Okay, what is God? Like, I mean, okay, so you said you can't define it. I mean, let me tell you, I would say that Zog exists. Is it possible that Zog exists? And you're like, okay, well, to see if Zog exists or not, we first have to identify what Zog is. I'm like, okay, Armin, you're saying Zog exists. It's possible that Zog exists. And like, okay, what is Zog? I'm like, I cannot define it for you. So how would you treat that statement? Is it possible that something that I have not defined exists? Yes, I will agree with you, okay? You have not defined X. Without definition, is it possible that this X thing that I have not defined exists? Yes, there's a greater than zero chance that this thing that you have not defined exists, okay? So now where do we go from here?
I understand what you're saying. All right, let's define God as the idea that there is something that connects us beyond matter, something beyond what we can explain, something that gives things meaning, something that makes it so that love isn't just chemicals. Love is a thing that transcends that.
So God is a desire.
Subjective.
That's not what I said. So you gave us a list of things that we don't know if they could. So you gave us a list of things, and I don't know if those lists of things are necessarily related or not, right? So you said something that is beyond material, and something that gives us meaning. I think that comes with the assumption that material things cannot give us meaning. I mean, I'm trying to understand you, okay? I'm not trying to make fun of you or dismiss you, okay? I'm really trying to have a good discussion here, okay? Because this seems to come up with the assumption that we cannot find meaning within the material world, right? So I still don't understand. Is that what you're saying? Like, yes, well, something, do we need? Yeah, go on.
It goes back to my original point that consciousness can't be explained by materialism. Neurons and matter cannot explain consciousness alone. And this is what I study. I'm a AI engineer, and so I work closely with neural networks, and so.
But yeah, okay, there's two possible. So Justin is asking you why. There's two possibilities here. Two possibilities. Either you're right, and consciousness cannot be explained with the material world, okay, or it can, okay, and we just and you're wrong. Like, we have the explanation, right? And there are a lot of, like, I looked into this a little bit, and there seems to be a lot of theories, and these theories keep getting expanded on and worked on and improved on, and it's moving towards a direction. But let's say, like, you're correct and it cannot be, okay? Is our failure as humans, okay? Because we humans, we have limitations, right? Like, we have some tools and try to figure things out, but we are limited in understanding the material world. Is our failure to explain consciousness, does that necessarily mean that something beyond matter is required to explain consciousness? What if our failure to explain consciousness is only a sign of our failure, not a sign of anything beyond material?
But that statement in itself is saying that the current knowledge we have can't explain it. And really what I'm trying to show here is how analogous that is.
That's just our failure.
You're using your current...
That's the limitation of the human mind and the human scientific method to date, to this point. That is not a sign, that is not evidence of anything beyond matter.
Yes, but it
Sorry, Justin,
we don't know. And what I'm trying to do is draw the parallel between that and the idea of whether or not God exists. In this discussion, the first thing that should be said is that we don't know if God exists or not.
Right. But the question is, should we believe in a God? Because just not knowing if the God exists doesn't get you to the finish line. We need to know if we should believe in a God, right? So, theoretically, your argument is that consciousness points towards the existence of a God. And I'm trying to figure out how. How do you get from consciousness to a God? Is it just a God of the gaps? You don't know how something works there for God?
It seems to me that you're just trying to say, make us admit that there is a chance that this entity exists. And I think our position has always been that everything is possible, but we won't believe in it until there's an evidence.
Right.
Like if you want us to admit that something, yeah.
But then your show should be.
We already have that position.
Experience, not the atheist.
No, that's your misunderstanding of what atheism means. Okay, so this is a problem. Okay, so I will give you that. Okay, yeah. Anything except anything that any unfalsifiable claim that you come up and give us here, there is a more than zero chance that it does exist. Okay, the problem is that the chance. Because there is infinite number of unfalsifiable claims that I could make, so the chances I would attribute a chance of 1 over infinity to each one of them, which is epsilon, which is as close to 0 as you can get. I will basically treat it as 0, even though it's not 0. Okay, that does not make me. So when you say that, then you should call yourself agnostic rather than atheist, is because you don't understand the definition of atheism. Agnosticism and atheism are not mutually exclusive. Atheism is not necessarily the claim that there is no God. Atheism is simply a lack of belief in God. If I don't believe in God, I'm an atheist. Now, in regards to gods, there are multiple definitions of gods, and towards certain definitions of gods, you could be a Gnostic atheist towards them, and certain definitions of gods, so for example, unfalsifiable definitions of God, you could be an agnostic atheist to those. So we have Gnostic atheism and agnostic atheism. If you define God to me in a way that is self-contradictory, for example, the tri-omni God, is defined, which is the God of all Abrahamic religions, are defined in a way that are self-contradictory. Towards that God, I'm a Gnostic atheist. But towards a deistic God, for example, or any other God that is unfalsifiable, towards that God, I'm an agnostic God, agnostic atheist, which means I will treat that God in the same way I treat vampires, Santa Claus, Peter Pan, the farting turtle, Russell's teapot, the dragon in the Carl Sagan's dragon in the garage, the flying spaghetti monster. All of these could be real, but I treat them as if they're not.
Okay, again,
that's actually the point spot on with my opinion as well.
The point of what...
Sorry, I didn't mean to talk over you.
...was for us to both... That's okay. The point of what I was saying at the beginning was just for us to all admit that we don't know if there is or isn't a God. And then I wanted to get into the deeper discussion. I would just like for us to objectively admit that we don't know if there is or isn't.
Would you say that the same thing about Santa Claus, for example?
But again, I'm pointing to things that can be seen as pointing to God, such as consciousness.
Right, but you're not actually talking about that.
Infinite probability. With the law of infinite probability, yes, I do actually have to entertain the idea that there could be a Santa Claus, as silly as it is. But it's a bit different when you talk about God.
But the God claim is as silly. Okay, so yeah, I will do the same thing. Okay, I will say, like, yes, we have to entertain that the chances is not 0, but it's so close to 0 that we could label it as silly, and we will continue living our lives as if it's not real, right?
And really, comparing God to Santa Claus isn't actually a fair comparison, because God is a theological concept found in various religions.
I agree. Santa Claus is more likely. I agree. Santa Claus is actually, God is a sillier argument, because at least I'm not going outside of space and time. It's actually more in line with what we understand about how the world works, as contradictory it might be, as less contradictory than the idea of God.
Yeah, a fat man that can defy the laws of physics is way more reasonable than the God hypothesis.
I think that, first of all, I said that God and Santa aren't the same, because God arises in many...
Right. We disagreed, though. Did you catch that part?
Santa Claus... What?
Right. We disagreed with your statement. We're saying Santa is more likely, right? It takes
You're
less
saying Santa is more
assumptions to
likely
believe in a
God.
Santa than a God, because you need to bake in all kinds of assumptions the minute you introduce a God. You need to bake in, why did God create? Is there just one of them? If there's only one, why is there one? Why is there not a million of them? Is the God good? Does the God give us an afterlife? Does the God care about us? Is the God even alive? It could be possible that there was a God that poofed everything into existence and then someone took his ass out. There's so many concepts of God that it's silly just to appeal to a God that you like without actually considering all the other terrible God hypotheses. And I think it's more likely that Santa Claus exists than God exists. And right now, the only argument you're having is that consciousness points to that God, but you can't define what God is, and you can't define why consciousness points to that God. Instead, you've redirected the conversation for like the last 10 minutes on trying to compel us to admit that basically anything is possible. Like it's possible that there could be a God, but you already know our position. Our position is that it is possible, but we have no reason to believe that it's true. So we need a reason to believe that it's true before we're willing to accept it. Just like it's possible that there's a tooth fairy, but you have no reason to believe in the tooth fairy until you find the evidence.
I would say, because there was a lot of things in what you just said, I would say objectively God is more likely because the concept of a transcendent being explains the origins of existence, consciousness, and morality, whereas Santa Claus
doesn't. It actually makes it worse.
Makes it way worse.
Reality.
It makes it worse. The God explanation actually creates a bigger problem than the problem that it's trying to solve. It explains a consciousness that is at least material, and we could come up with theories for it, but a consciousness so mysterious beyond. It actually tries to solve consciousness by introducing a different consciousness that is more mysterious than the consciousness that we're trying to explain. That is beyond space and time. How is that explanation of anything?
Yeah, because our consciousness, every evidence we have states that our consciousness is a derivative from the brain. And you're trying to tell us that there's a consciousness out there that is not part of a brain. It has no physical manifestation. It's completely immaterial. And this is completely in opposition from what we see from all of our observations. But then you also have to bake in the fact that if we had this thing that gave us consciousness, it cared so much to create us, then he screwed up. He made all kinds of problems. Like the earth randomly executes 100,000 inhabitants a year on average through natural disasters. Why would we believe in a God that is like so asleep at the wheel that this is the conscious experience that he created for us?
Also, if consciousness is a problem, isn't God's consciousness also a problem, a bigger problem?
It's even bigger.
How are we going to solve that? How are we going to solve that problem?
Just kicking the can down the road.
Yeah.
What you said about consciousness arising from things we observe isn't true. Science can't explain consciousness.
Yeah, but
who said that?
Whatever, even if it couldn't, it doesn't seem like there's any other way to, like, when people say science can't explain something, first of all, usually they're wrong, because many times science actually explains the thing that they say they can't. But even if they're right, then we don't know, because like I've never seen somebody actually identify correctly something that science can't explain, and then they are so, it takes a huge level of arrogance to think that you can explain something that the entire scientific community cannot explain. Like if the proper position to have, if science cannot explain something, is okay, then we have no idea. Like we can know. Don't make a claim. Do not make a claim. Just wait. Right.
Yeah. Just because you don't know something doesn't mean you can insert God into it. Right. Like if I said, because we can't explain consciousness, I'm going to invent, there's these magic unicorns. They're consciousness granting unicorns, and they are the explanation for consciousness. Every time somebody is born and they reach the age of 6 months, the consciousness unicorn comes around and magically grants them consciousness. This is equally as valid as the argument you're laying down for consciousness. But you would inherently say that my explanation is silly. but it's no more silly than the one you're doing. All you're saying is there's something I don't know, so I'm going to insert my imagination into the gap. This is God of the gaps. That's all this is.
Again, there was a lot there that you said. Some of it had fundamental issues.
There was.
Some of it is valid. I don't know. There was a lot there. I think that there's a fundamental issue here in how people are viewing God. I mean, are we imagining?
I wouldn't address anything I said either. You notice how like Arm and I are responding to the things that you say, and then when we respond to what you say, you just move on to something else without actually addressing our rebuttals. That's not really like an honest way to have dialogue. What you're not doing is having dialogue. You're just fishing for like a new topic that you could move to, and then you want us to respond to it. But like if you want to have honest dialogue, you have to respond to the things that we said as well. Don't just say that was problematic and move on.
All right. Could you restate it in a more concise way?
Yes, you're doing a God of the gaps argument. You're saying there's something I don't know, therefore God. But I could use that for anything. I can say we don't know consciousness, therefore there's a consciousness unicorn. It's not a God, it's just a consciousness unicorn. It's a product of the universe. It's part of the eternal universe. And every time an infant reaches the age of 6 months, the consciousness unicorn comes around and grants its consciousness. Given the argument that you're using, my argument for the consciousness unicorn is equally as valid, which means if your God is only as valid as the consciousness unicorn, it's not a good argument.
No, because God isn't what grants the consciousness. God is what makes that possible. God is that.
No, the consciousness unicorn makes it possible.
I would say my farting
turtle. Well, you could rename God the consciousness unicorn and say that. That's really no different than what I'm saying. It makes it so silly.
The reality is consciousness is a derivative of materialism. That's the reality of the world. That's why we never see consciousness outside of the material world. We've tried. We've done out-of-body experiments where we stimulated people's brain using DMT and deep brain stimulation, and then we quizzed them and tested them to see if their consciousness left their body, and it never did. We've done near-death studies. Sam Parnia did near-death studies from 2008 to 2014, and then he did another project from 2015 all the way to 2023, the AWARE project and the AWARE project number 2, where they literally took people from cardiac arrest that came back to life who claimed to have out-of-body experiences and tried to validate if they were actually having out-of-body experiences, and they couldn't do it. All the data we have suggests that people are a product of materialism. Our consciousness is materialism. My dog's consciousness is materialism. The turtle's consciousness is materialism. All the way down to the lowest level of consciousness, bacteria or ants. These various levels of consciousness are derivative of material. Until we can demonstrate that consciousness can exist without materialism, I have no reason to believe that there is a consciousness outside of materialism that caused all things to be.
I mean, even the word material requires a material medium. So I don't.
The problem with what you just said is your claim assumes materialism is the only valid framework, but the nature of consciousness remains one of the biggest unsolved questions in science and philosophy.
Unsolved. Okay, why is it that, Rich, I don't understand why people think unsolved means that they could insert whatever. Okay, unsolved. Yeah, even if it is unsolved, that doesn't mean that you could shove in your mythology or your mumbo jumbo in the middle of it. Because as soon as every time you see, like, how is the God of the gaps still a thing? Right? I think atheists have demonstrated if you want to shove a God where something cannot be explained, then we could shove whatever else we want in there. Like that's such an easy point to understand.
Straw manning my argument. You're framing it into something it isn't to make it seem silly.
Show me how I made a straw man. It is
silly.
The God of the gaps is basically you're doing a classic example of God of the gaps. This is yeah.
Here is the fundamental issue with how this show is set up. You make it so I have
Okay, we don't care about the meta. We don't listen. You can keep your God of the gaps. We'll find you a gap to shove your God. We don't want to hear any more circular reasoning about the God of the gaps. And I think it's approaching 8 o'clock now, and so we're at the end of our show at this point. So Lewis, we really appreciate you coming up and talk to us about consciousness. I think you might want to rethink the God of the gaps argument. That's not a strong argument for God. You can make that argument for literally anything.